Described as a straight-talking, hard-charging, independent leader, Congressman John P. Murtha was the first Vietnam combat veteran elected to Congress. Since then, he has been intimately involved with governmental decisions about America's national security and foreign policy. We'll talk with him about his life of public service and about the significant events in our recent history that he has witnessed. Let's take note with Congressman Murtha, known by his constituents as Congressman Jack Murtha. His new book, From Vietnam to 9/11, on the front lines of national security, is published by Penn State Press. Thanks so much for joining us.
Nice to be here, Patty.
You were elected to Congress in 1974 and of course are still there today. Tell us a little bit about your path to Congress, from college to the military to a seat in Congress.
Well, when I first went to W&J from high school, I majored in political science. And as I studied political science, I realized that the elected office is where the real influence and power is in the country, whether it's in the House or the Senate or elected to president. And so I pursued that the whole time, studying political science, studying economics, studying national defense. And I probably specialized in national defense more than anything else. When I was working in business, I still took time in the reserves. I enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1952 in the height of the Korean War. As a matter of fact, I was telling the former coach at W&J the other day how I stood there one winter day thinking, all these guys are in Korea and I'm here playing football and basketball, and this is not the place I should be. So, and when I enlisted, my mother wasn't too happy about it. She felt she had graduated from college, her father had graduated from college, so they expected me to finish college before I went to the military. But once I enlisted, she became, and all three of my brothers finally went into the Marine Corps after that, and every one she was unhappy about until the last one she thought was going to the Army. So the Marine Corps sends out so much propaganda or information that she was, thought he was going, but we all went to the Marine Corps. And so we've had a dedication, and the family history back to the Revolutionary War was being involved in the wartime situation, but also in politics. And so I just fell into it, I guess, naturally. I don't even know when the decision was made, because I always believed that it was something that I needed to do.
And in fact, after your active duty ended, you volunteered to go to Vietnam, and not for the desk job that they wanted you to take, but to be there on the front lines.
Yeah, well, Patty, and that was interesting because they sent me the first telegram after I volunteered to go, and I was in business at the time, but I was in the reserves. I'd been to jungle warfare school in Panama, I'd been to counterterrorism school, all those kind of things as a reservist. And I felt like as a reservist, I should be on active duty as they were increasing the number of Marines in Vietnam. So they sent me a telegram and said, you're assigned to Camp Lejeune. I said, no, that's not what I have in mind. I've been to Camp Lejeune. I said, I want to be with the forces overseas if I'm going to go on active duty. So they finally sent me that telegram, and then as each step of the way, they tried to stop me and say, well, you stay here, we'll send somebody else. I said, no, this says Ground Forces Vietnam. So I finally got there and argued even at the division headquarters where they wanted to stop me. I remember this lieutenant colonel wanted to get out to the field, and I said, no, this is not what I consider ground forces. And the colonel, the S1, overheard the conversation. And it was interesting because he said, I don't want a reservist running my administrative side. Send him out to the field. So I finally got to the field and worked in intelligence, which fits right in with what we're doing today. It was invaluable, the information that I learned while I was in Vietnam. We had no trouble fighting the enemy and overcoming the enemy, just like the latest Iraqi war. The problem was finding the enemy and locating him and then surrounding him or capturing him from the standpoint of interaction. Our weapons were more powerful. We won every single battle, but finding him was the key, and it's the same thing today. The intelligence is absolutely essential to our success.
And in fact, that's something that you point out time and time again in your book, and you refer to a plaque that was given to you by a gunnery sergeant in Vietnam that reads, "Victory is knowing your enemy."
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about our intelligence gathering capabilities today.
Yeah. Well, Patty, it really is extensive. We spend as much money as many countries do in their entire budget for intelligence gathering. And the gathering is one thing, but the analysis of the information. For instance, right now, every intelligence agency in the world said they have weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but we haven't found them. Our CIA, where we spend so much money, said to me personally, they have the weapons of mass destruction. So if they don't have, we're going to be embarrassed because our intelligence agencies were wrong. They have been wrong in the past. They've made all kinds of mistakes, as all of us do. But we're confident in the end we'll find those because every intelligence agency in the world has that. But again, leading up to this war, intelligence was a key to the president making the decision he was going to go to war. The fact that they had terrorist activity there, that they had weapons of mass destruction, all those things led up to the buildup of forces and then finally going to war. So intelligence is still the key, and especially today when we have a different type of a war. For years I fought the Soviet Union, meaning when I say I fought them, the United States fought against the Soviet Union. And Colin Powell said to me one time, it's hard to adjust from the Cold War mentality to today. And of course that's true. It's very difficult because of intelligence and because of the disparity of information you gather from all over the world. Terrorism is a perfect example of that, how difficult it is to find these small cells which are so inclusive and very difficult to penetrate.
And in fact, in the book, you compare the war on terrorism to the war on drugs.
Yeah, exactly right. Because first of all, there's a funding source, and much of the war on drugs, the funds go to terrorism in many cases. And of course, then you take the next step. They're illegal. They're hard to find. They're very small cells that work together, and you go one place and they go someplace else. And it's worldwide. Terrorism is worldwide, as is drug selling worldwide. And drug selling funds much of terrorist activity. So we work hard trying to integrate or to infiltrate the drug centers because we know that'll help us. Which is such an insidious thing, help us fight terrorism.
You've actually been concerned about our ability to launch counterterrorism probably since the early 1990s when the poison gas was used in the Tokyo subways.
Yeah, Patty, I remember watching that in the news and saying to myself, this could happen any place. That sarin attack which happened in Tokyo. And I said, we need to do something about that. So I put $50 million in the budget. This was over 10 years ago. And that $50 million was to go to the National Guard for them to be able to respond after the first responders in a national crisis in case sarin was released in any of our subways or airports in the big cities where normally you would expect an attack. It was very difficult. The National Guard did not want that duty. They wanted to be able to respond to a military response. But we worked our way through it. They finally became convinced that something needed to be done. We now have 27 teams throughout the nation in 27 different states. Eventually we'll have one in each state, and we'll have near the cities because we expect that's the place where they're most likely to have a terrorist attack. Now, we're also at the same time under Governor Ridge's influence, we're trying to fund Homeland Defense because they need communications, they need to be able to talk to each other, they need to be able to respond to the same type of an attack because they're really the ones on the front line. So it's a complicated thing, a very expensive thing. It's hard on our economy, this whole war on terrorism, but it's really absolutely essential to our survival.
Now, your book is really part personal memoir, part thoughtful analysis. It begins with Vietnam, and it includes your personal and direct experiences in international crises up to September 11th. What was the impetus for writing the book?
Well, John Plaschel came to me. He worked for me for years in the Appropriations Committee. And he said, you ought to write a book. He had traveled with me into all these fascinating business that we're in and seen us being able to change world events. And I said, John, no way I can write a book. He said, look, I'll do a lot of the research. You dictate and I'll edit. And as I said to you before the show, I used to criticize reporters. But I'll tell you this, I admire him more since I got finished because it took me 3 years and I thought it'd take 6 months. And we had to be exact. I sent it to a lot of former ambassadors, people I'd worked with that knew details of stories. For instance, I thought Zia, who was the president of Pakistan, we were sending the money through, had been killed in a accident or a bombing in an airplane. Instead, I find out from former Ambassador Oakley, he was killed with mechanical failure at the airplane. So little things like that which discredit you if you're not accurate. And General Zinni, I sent him a copy and asked him to review certain sections of it that he had been involved with. And of course, Charlie Horner, who went with me, made extensive notes. So at any rate, it evolved out of him saying we ought to write the book. And then the more I thought about it, the more I realized the impact that I had had by traveling and by specializing in defense. Wilbur Mills said to me when I first went to Congress, Wilbur Mills was a member of Congress for 35 years, an expert on tax law. He said, specialize in one area, become an expert, because then people will come to you and you'll have an influence. And keep your word. That's the two pieces of advice he gave me. And so I specialized in national defense. And they do come to me. I do get calls from presidents, from secretaries of state, from secretaries of defense about national defense, and it's had a real impact.
And in fact, in the past 30 years, you've counseled every president in those 30 years and have played a pivotal part in defense appropriations. What has it been like as the ranking Democrat working on this subcommittee, in a Republican administration?
Well, Patty, the administrations come and go, and Congress as a whole comes and goes, and this is part of the problem. For a while, there was this thing about term limits. So people wanted to, okay, there ought to be a quick turnover. And if you look at public reaction, they said, yeah, get rid of members of Congress. But you need elected officials who've been around and have a historic knowledge of what's happened so that they can give advice to presidents and to members of Congress. And it's invaluable to the system itself. The way it was set up under the Constitution is absolutely essential. The other thing, I remember my great-grandmother who her husband was in the Civil War, and she lived to 96. And she said one person can make a difference. And as I read through, as I dictated in this book, and as I went through these experiences, I realized that's as much about this as anything else. There's 535 members of Congress, including the Senate. And if you don't specialize, you're not going to make a difference. If you don't become an expert, you're not going to make a difference. But if you do, and you have the trust of people who haven't been around as long, they're going to ask your opinion. So I've given, I think, some good advice to a lot of different people.
In the last 30 years, you have been intimately involved in government decisions about America's national security and foreign policy. So you have a unique perspective on America's international successes and failures. Off the top of your head, what would you consider some of the great successes?
Well, I think the wall coming down was probably the biggest success, and that was a long, hard battle. That was the Vietnam War, that was the Korean War, that was the Cold War, so-called Cold War. It was fighting in Central America, which was so opposed by so many people in the United States. But all those things played a part. But the key part was in Afghanistan, when the Soviets went into Afghanistan and they lost the support of the public. And part of that was due to what we had done in Congress. We provided Stinger missiles to the Afghan freedom fighters, and they shot down the planes, the Russian planes, so the Russians could no longer support their troops out in the field. It became really a cause célèbre. And they fought them right to the borders. And finally, they lost the support of the public. And I've always said the reason that Russia fell was not only because of Afghanistan, but because they tried to govern from the top down. And in this country, our real success is governing from the bottom up. And so that's probably the most successful long-term foreign policy that we've had.
But now we aided Afghanistan in defense from Russia, but in the end, many say we left Afghanistan high and dry, and of course the result was the Taliban and Osama bin Laden.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is what we don't do well. You look at some of the successes, the Marshall Plan after World War II, and MacArthur's handling Japan after World War II, those were successes. But we have a tendency after a war, and Afghanistan's a perfect example. We helped the freedom fighters and we left, and it became worse. And we're having some problems now. Afghanistan's not over. We had to send troops in. We've decimated the Al-Qaeda, but we still haven't, that's not a successful operation completely yet. But Bosnia the same way. We went into Bosnia, and of course we're trying to set up the judicial system, the police system. Very complicated. It's not they're not used to democracy, they're used to dictatorship, so it's a real problem trying to work your way through after the war's over. A lot of people criticize Bush 1 because of his stopping in Kuwait. He just went through Kuwait. Now, as I explained to people, our resolution in the Congress said drive them out of Kuwait. Our resolution in the UN said drive them out of Kuwait. We were killing thousands of people every minute. And if we would have gone on, we'd have lost the coalition that was so carefully put together by the president. So it's easy to criticize after it's over, but one of the things we have to do better in this particular situation is when we have won the war in Iraq, we now have to win the peace. And you got 3 separate factions there which have fought with each other forever. And it's not going to be an easy thing. It's going to be expensive. The last war, the coalition paid for it. They paid $60 billion. It came through the committee that I chaired at the time. And this time, they paid nothing. The coalition, the so-called coalition, has come up with no money at all. They come up with some troops, some help, but no money. And of course, the way we run the after action is going to be very important to our success. Whether we can set up a judicial system, set up a police force that is trusted, because obviously we have been demonized by Al Jazeera for 10 years. So people don't trust us. They want us out of there as soon as we can get out. And this is true in most of the Arab countries. So we got some real we've had some real success in war, but our biggest fault has been after the war.
Now, you have been credited for helping to usher in democracy in places like Panama and the Philippines. Is it realistic, in your opinion, that democracy can come to a country like Iraq?
Well, it's always a struggle. There's no question about the fact that when you have poverty, when you don't have economic success as we've had in this country, you're going to have some underlying resentment. You're going to have people upset. And when you have a dictatorship, they can suppress that. But when you have a democracy, it's a much different situation. For instance, right now, we've liberated Iraq, but you see all the demonstrations, which they couldn't do under Saddam Hussein. So it's going to be a long-term thing. We have to convince them that it's better for them to have a democracy and to rule their own country. But of course, look at the countries around them. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, all our allies there are not democracies. So it's going to be a struggle, and it'll be a long-term debate and competition.
And do you think we will be there for the long haul?
Well, I'm afraid we're going to be there quite a while. Harry Truman said after World War II, we'll have the troops out in 2 years. Well, they're still there in Europe. And one of the things I've found in my travels is that nobody can lead but the United States. I kept telling President Clinton, don't go into Bosnia, because if you do, even though there's all kinds of killing, which none of us like, it's a tragic situation, but we'll be mired there and won't be able to get out unless you get an agreement. Well, he got an agreement, and we've been there even with the agreement, and still there's the same type of hatred below the surface in Bosnia as there was before. We're trying to figure out a way to turn it over to the Europeans. The Europeans should have handled it. I kept saying, let the Europeans handle this problem. They can't do it. They don't trust each other, and nobody trusts any of the Europeans. So there's so many different times when they have found, after World War I, the treaty didn't work out, and they set up Yugoslavia. So force in the United States' leadership and trust is really the key to world security as well as world peace. Because
of your own experiences as a Marine and in Vietnam, and in all of the on-site investigations you've done in some of the hottest spots in the world, you know our troops, and you said in your book, every time I visit our troops in the field, I am struck by their irrepressible and commendable can-do mindset. Yeah. This can-do attitude is one of our military's greatest strengths, but it can get us into trouble too. We must take care not to go overboard in our efforts to solve other people's problems. And
Somalia is a perfect example of that. I remember going to Somalia several times, and I remember this lieutenant colonel who was telling me about what he was doing. He says, I'm practically the mayor of this community. I said, wait a minute, Colonel. And the general was there, all the commanders are, it's not your job to be the mayor of this community. Your job is to deliver humanitarian resources to Somalia. I knew if we started getting into nation building, we'd start to run into a problem. And we did, because military, as good as they are, as hard as they work, they want to solve problems right now. But it's a very complicated thing when you're trying to set up. You have to know the background, all the idiosyncrasies of that country. You have to know the tribal differences, and very few Americans know that. They just know that this is the right thing to do, and they try to do it, and it doesn't always work out. This is true almost every place we go. It's why we were so careful in Iraq in this last war in trying to be as precise as we could with our weapon system, so that when it's over, we would have less damage. It would be easier to help that country rebuild itself. But all the places I've gone, we always try to do it a little bit too much. And I've seen examples in Central America, wherever I've been, where the United States reacts or tries to do too much, and in the end the people resent that. Iraq's a perfect example. There's a great number of people in Iraq who want us out of there.
You also say that we spend too much time talking about exit strategy. You say that's the wrong question. What we should be concerned more with is why are we getting involved rather than how are we going to get out of this?
Well, I remember when President Bush, after he had lost the election, he saw all the starving people in Somalia, and he said, we have to help those people. And I told him at the time he would not be able to get out. Why are we going there? It's not in our national interest. 2 or 3 things I've learned in sending troops to an area. First of all, it has to be in our national security interest. And second of all, we got to send enough troops to make sure that our troops are protected in case something happens. And once they get in there, of course, then they try to solve the problem. But I remember him saying to me, he turned to me and he said, Jack, you disagree with my policy. This is President Bush 1 again. And I said, yes, I don't think we should go there. It's not in our national security interest, as terrible as the humanitarian thing is, and we won't be able to get out. And of course, that's exactly what happened. We went in, the mission changed, as it always does. All at once it changed. We were going after a deed rather than humanitarian, and this is almost every time we get involved, we try to solve more problems than we're capable of solving, and consequently we get ourselves in trouble, and then we can't get out. But the key is deciding when we should go in, and like right now, North Korea is probably as serious a national security problem as any country in the world. We have to be very careful how we handle that. If they do have nuclear weapons, obviously much more of a threat than any other country. And the Bush administration is handling it much different than in any other country. But what we do in one place always reflects on another. The initial reaction of the administration was, well, we went into Iraq, now North Korea is giving in. North Korea wasn't giving in at all. North Korea is a very stubborn country to negotiate with. And the diplomats, sometimes they sound like they're beating around the bush, but sometimes you have to do that in order to get some people to agree. We don't need to say how strong we are. Everybody knows how strong we are. What we have to do, be a little conciliatory. And the solution in Iraq is going to be working with the UN, working with the coalition, and then broadening our coalition to help other people pay for the rehabilitation of Iraq.
In fact, you say in the book that we can expect our national security to be challenged when our military is weak or when we are perceived as being irresolute. Yeah. I want you to comment on that, but also, what if we're perceived as bullies?
Yeah. Well, I think both of them are a real detriment to our national policy. For instance, after World War II, we immediately reduced the number of forces, misled the Chinese and the North Koreans to decide that we weren't interested in South Korea, and we didn't have the forces because we'd reduced from 16 million troops down to a couple million. They miscalculated and, of course, went into Korea. After the Korean War, we did the same thing in Vietnam. We were completely, well, when I went into the Korean War, I had to wear civilian clothes for 2 weeks because I didn't even have uniforms as they expanded. So after every war, the United States has made the mistake, and then somebody miscalculates. Then on the other hand, when you become a bully, they resent it. We don't need to act like a bully. We need to act like we want to work with them in trying to solve some of these problems. And I think that's as important as anything else that we do.
With just literally a couple of seconds remaining, 10, what do you consider the greatest threat facing this country today?
I think the North Korean threat is probably the greatest threat we face today.
Okay, we'll have to save it for another time to find out how to solve that threat. Our guest has been John P. Murtha. His new book, a must-read, is from Vietnam to 9/11. It's published by Penn State Press. For Take Note, I'm Patty Satalia.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.